So today I got something pretty fun, I think. I'm going to do a tier list of all video game controllers from all the different consoles we've had over the past 50 plus years. So let me just clarify before we get started. I'm not going to be doing third party controllers, so companies that made controllers for a console, but it wasn't actually made by the console manufacturer themselves. So think of, I don't even know, like the Mad Catz controllers and all those like third party ones, they will be excluded from this list. And yeah, that's pretty much the criteria that I have. I do allow for pro controllers and redesigned controllers if they are actually made by the company that manufactured the console. And also, like, there's a reason to use that instead of the regular control scheme, if that makes sense. You'll understand more as we go on. Actually, we'll just get started with the F tier, and you will probably already see what I'm talking about. Yep. All right. So first we have the, we have a very, yeah, this group of controllers is definitely the worst that we've ever seen. I know some people are gonna fight with me over this one, over the N64. We'll talk about that very soon. But starting off with the Atari Jaguar, what can I say? It would be a much better controller if they just cut this entire number pad thing off and just left it at that. Actually, the original Jaguar controller only had 3 buttons and didn't have shoulder buttons, which by 1994 standards was already a very outdated control scheme and severely limited your gameplay experience, only having 3 buttons and a D-pad. That's essentially what the original controller had. But then they had a Pro controller that added 3 more buttons, kind of like the 3-button Sega Genesis, and some shoulder buttons as well. But at the end of the day, regardless of what version we're talking about, the D-pad was absolutely horrendous, and D-pad was a very important thing back then. Didn't really have analog sticks yet. And half of this controller was just empty space with these number pads. And, we'll talk about the number pad controls a little bit more later, but it's just a terrible controller design. One of the many reasons why the Jaguar is one of the worst consoles in video game history. And then moving on to the Nintendo 64. So some people, like I said, are going to fight me on this, but I don't care. I mean, some people would probably agree that's not good, but think that F tier is a little bit too harsh, and it should go to D tier at the very least. Look, I understand what they were trying to do, having the 3 handles. With certain games, you'll grab these 2 handles, and then there's other games like you'll grab these 2, or you'll just grab like the 2 on the sides, and depending on the type of game you're playing, you'll have a different reason to hold the controller differently. But at the end of the day, the analog stick, which analog sticks started to become a very important thing in the era of 3D gaming, was very uncomfortable and was horrible. The trigger on the back end of the middle handle was also very awkward to use and control. And the buttons, honestly, the button layout itself, like over here, wasn't that bad. If they just added, I don't know, a second analog stick, made the analog sticks better, and kept the D-pad, I mean, the D-pad wasn't great, but it was serviceable, then it would have been a fine controller. And actually, I think a lot of the people who play N64 games these days use a third-party controller that kind of does that. So, yeah, the N64 controller is no good. Anyone who tries to defend it, you're just wrong. And then we got the Wii U Classic controller, specifically the Wii U Pro Classic controller, because there's just a regular Classic controller that doesn't have analog sticks and doesn't have these handles on the bottom. But it's essentially the same thing. It's going to be F tier either way. The main thing is that, very similar to the N64 controller, the joysticks, the analog sticks, are so bad and so uncomfortable that it is very difficult to enjoy and play games on it. Because this was pretty much made for first-person shooter games that don't, that are better to play without the motion controls. I remember I got one of these with my copy of GoldenEye 007 for the Wii. It actually was like a gold, well, not real gold, but, it had a gold look to it. and it was pretty much the same controller. You know, the two bumpers, the two triggers. The bumpers and the triggers, though, just feel like too thin. Like they have no, there's no real feedback to them. The buttons were fine. These buttons were fine. The D-pad, you know, it was basically the nunchuck, not the nunchuck, the Wiimote D-pad, which was, you know, not great, but I guess fine. I mean, the thing is, the Wii had a very heavy emphasis on the Virtual Console and playing old games that required a D-pad, and, you know, it kind of worked, but it definitely wasn't a great D-pad. But overall, the main thing why I have it in the F tier above everything else is that you can't just have it stand alone, plugged into the console, like you could plug in a GameCube controller to the Wii. This, you had to plug in to the Wiimote, the same slot that you plug the nunchuck into the Wii Remote, you had to plug this thing into the Wii Remote. And it was just such an awkward experience having a controller in your hand and then just having another controller flopping around off of it. It was just such an awkward... I don't know why they decided to do it that way, to require you to plug it into a Wiimote instead of just being allowed to plug it in separately, because it has all the buttons you need. You don't really need a Wiimote for this to function. So that alone made me not ever want to use the controller ever again and just switch to a GameCube controller. Yeah, the Wii U Classic Pro controller was horrendous. Definitely deserves to be in the F tier. And then we have the OG Steam controller, which I know kind of developed a cult following over the years. There are some people who love it and actually still use it. There's a very small amount, but they do exist. The whole idea of it was to take the best of both worlds, to have, you know, the comfort and ergonomic feel of a standard game controller with the benefits of keyboard and mouse, specifically mouse precision, because you have the trackpads both over here. And, you know, the concept of it was interesting, but the execution was terrible because this was ultimately a very uncomfortable experience to, you know, maybe at least have a second analog stick somewhere over here. So, like, instead of one of these big trackpads that take up so much space on the screen. And it just wasn't, any way you slice it, was not a comfortable gaming experience at all. And there's a reason why it was discontinued very shortly after it was produced. And this was the whole basis also of the original Steam machine back in 2014. This was what Valve was marketing, like, to appeal people to buy the Steam machine, is the Steam controller. But it was so bad that the majority of Steam machines that did come out were packaged with Xbox 360 controllers, because that's how awful the Steam controller was. That they own console, that, you know, or console-like, whatever you want to call the Steam machines, like, it was so, the controller was so bad that the Steam machines didn't even come with it, even though they came out around the same time. And I know that originally the Steam machines came out before the Steam controller, they're like the Alienware Alpha, but still, even after this came out, they were still packaging them with 360 controllers. So, yeah, not just really bad. Awful, awful, awful controller. And then we can kind of just lump these three together. We have the Atari 5200, the ColecoVision, and Intellivision. They all have the same problem, similar to the Jaguar, where you just have this huge number pad that's taking up way too much space. Like, I understand the utility of a number pad back in the 1980s, but you can't justify having it taking up so much room on the controller. Like, imagine if you just took this number pad out completely and you just had this. It would be a good controller. This whole, I don't know, this knob thing just sucked ass anyway, like, regardless. Same thing with this. Just terrible controllers, any way you slice it, but yeah, these are horrible, and there's a reason why after this generation, it was the 5200, so that was actually in between the second and third. It was part of the lost generation of consoles, was the 5200 and the ColecoVision. And the Intellivision was part of the second generation. It was competing against the 2600. Yeah. If you compare the controller for the Intellivision versus the 2600, it's night and day difference. And even comparing, like, you know, the 5200 to the 2600. Yeah, huge downgrade. Definitely a huge downgrade. And then finally, our final entry into the F tier is the Ouya controller, which was a cheap piece of shit controller that was so... Not only was it uncomfortable, it just felt like cheap piece of crap. No game ever felt comfortable or satisfying to use with this controller. The whole idea of the Ouya back then was that it was a budget console that was only $100. So you could see where they cut a lot of corners and when they cut a lot of costs, not only in the power of the console itself, which wasn't meant to be powerful to begin with, so you can give, you can give them some leeway there, but the actual controller was so bad that it broke very easily and was pretty much unusable for many people because of just how unreliable it was, that it was a huge part of why the Wii U, we'll get to the Wii U, why the Ouya was a huge, huge failure. And then let's go to the D tier. Okay, so we got some more controversial picks here. People are gonna be really mad with this entire tier list. People are gonna disagree. Starting off with the Sega Dreamcast. Like, look, guys, I love the Dreamcast. It still holds a special place in my heart. It was really sad. I'm really sad that Sega doesn't make consoles anymore. But holy shit, man! Like, if we're like, another thing that I should have mentioned in the beginning when we're talking about the criteria for the tier list and the tier rankings, how I actually rank the controllers themselves is something else that I should have mentioned. So it's all time relative. So we're talking about how it actually was during its time, and if it was severely lacking compared to the competition. And the Dreamcast definitely would fall under that umbrella, considering that, the D-pad was terrible. Horrible, horrible D-pad, which was still an important thing in the late 90s. The ABXY was fine. The triggers were fine. That analog stick, though, was horrible. It was so bad, so bad. Not quite N64 bad, but pretty bad. And you didn't have a second analog stick, where it was starting to become, we're talking about 1999. We're not talking PS1 era anymore. We're talking PS2, GameCube, OG Xbox era, essentially. Because the Dreamcast was part of that generation, even though it already died and was discontinued by the time the Xbox and GameCube arrived to the scene. But still, imagine if the Dreamcast wasn't discontinued. It would be essentially mandatory to have another controller in order to actually, in order for your console to be usable. And even some of their flagship titles, like Sonic Adventure, were severely limited by the controller and its own limitations. It resulted in probably the worst camera controls that we've ever had in a video game ever. If you all ever played Sonic Adventure, you know what I'm talking about. And not having that second stick was a huge part of that. Yeah, it was really bad. The VMU, was a cool little gimmick, I guess, but, and it did feel ergonomic. It felt comfortable, and it did kind of serve as the foundation and basis of what would eventually become the Xbox controllers, which for the most part were fantastic, aside from the one that we're about to talk about. But, yeah, Dreamcast controller, it's, D for Dreamcast. That's what the D tier is for. it was not good at all. And really held the console back. And now let's talk about the Duke. The Duke! Okay, so honestly, it was a very interesting layout, but it just felt like everything was just too smushed together. The ABXY was not a good layout, and having the two bumpers above it, I can kind of understand what they were going for. It was kind of sort of like the 6-button layout that we've had during the 4th and 5th generation of consoles, so you kind of could see that 6-button layout over here, but it just didn't work with modern gaming. Having those two bumpers over here instead of having them as shoulder buttons, which we would eventually get, and what we did get with the DualShock 2, but yeah, that was one problem, and it just felt like it was too chunky. Like, it didn't feel comfortable to use. The big Xbox logo in the middle, as cool as it was, took up way too much space and didn't provide a comfortable gameplay experience. The D-pad was pretty bad, But to be fair, at that point, the D-pad was less important than it was in previous years. You know, in the modern 3D era of gaming, the D-pad had less relevance. So, you know, the Duke, it's, yeah, I think D tier is a perfect ranking for the Duke controller. I mean, Microsoft would probably agree, considering that halfway through, not even halfway, like shortly after the OG Xbox came out, packaged with this controller, they had to redesign the controller in the middle of the generation. When that happens, you know you have a bad controller. Like, any way you slice it, it's not good. And you can say the same thing about the original PS1 controller, which you could see, if you take these two handles off, is very similar, almost identical, you could say, to the Super Nintendo controller. Remember, Sony and Nintendo were originally collaborating on an add-on for the Super Nintendo that would add CD disc support. It was called the Nintendo PlayStation. And because Nintendo and Sony had a falling out, that led Sony to go their own way and make their own console, which would end up biting Nintendo in the ass significantly, especially if you're talking about the PS1 versus N64. The reason why this controller sucked is because while there are some games that were perfectly fine and like were meant for this control layout, like Crash Bandicoot and a few others, the D-pad, like, not having the analog stick was a very, very, very outdated thing at that point, where we were entering the era of 3D gaming, and you really needed the analog sticks in order to properly control and to play the game the way it was meant to be played, like to play more complex 3D games, which, you know, compared to platformers, which are very simple in terms of movement and gameplay, a game like Resident Evil, this doesn't cut it, obviously. So I'm going to put it in the D tier just because of the fact that if you bought a PlayStation in 1995 and you only had this controller, you had to buy another one because this just didn't cut it. And they eventually did come out with a DualShock 1, but yeah, this just didn't hold up to modern standards at all. And then we have the Master System controller, which you could see is heavily inspired from the NES controller, having the same rectangular shape and the two buttons, the only difference really being the D-pad. Nintendo at the time had a patent over the D-pad, so Sega or any other company couldn't just simply copy Nintendo and just put a D-pad on the controller. So they had what they called the control pad, which was basically like a D-pad, but a lot less comfortable and ergonomic. So, yeah, I mean, it wasn't a very comfortable experience playing games through the Master System controller. And, like, it wasn't outright terrible, so that's why it's not in the F tier. But if you're comparing it to the NES, it is just night and day difference. It's, yeah, very lacking in comparison. So, let's talk about the during the same generation, actually, during the 8-bit era. Alongside the Master System and NES, you had the Atari 7800, which was Atari's 8-bit console that was graphically on par with the NES. And, you know, while it was a huge improvement over the 5200, it was still pretty bad just because of how huge that joystick was. It was so incredibly uncomfortable to control. If they made the joystick a little bit small, not even a little bit smaller, like half the size, I think it would work. Like, having the handle and then having the two buttons on the side, not terrible, but, I mean, you know, still not perfect compared to what we had with the NES. But still, it's just like, yeah, I don't know what they were thinking with that huge joystick that's, like, bigger than a fucking stick shift on a car. And then, in a similar vein, we have the TurboGrafx 16, which I know is a beloved console, but the D-pad was no good. And in the era of D-pad being a very important thing, not having a good one, it's going to knock it down a few points, for sure. And remember, this was towards the end of the, this was actually the beginning of the 16-bit era of gaming, where, you know, having more than two buttons was a pretty good thing to have. So that was another thing that also you know, by modern standards, meaning modern, 1989, 1988, it was not holding up. And then we have the DualShock 3. Okay. People are also going to not like this one, but I think it is completely justified. And this is coming from someone, if you remember my console tier list that I did years and years and years ago, which I still stand by today, I put the PS3 in the S tier. So I am not a PS3 or Sony hater. People may think that already, having two PlayStation controllers in the D tier, but they deserve to be there. Because, oh my god, was the controller so uncomfortable to use. Those analog sticks were just way too big compared to the small size of the controller itself. Very often, my two thumbs would keep touching each other when I'm using the analog sticks, and it just felt really, really, really small. Especially as I got older, because I was still a kid when I was on my PS3, and when the PS3 was in its life cycle. And, the D-pad is still horrible like it was in the original PS1 controller, and the DualShock 1, the DualShock 2. I'm not going to really knock it down too much for that. And the shoulder buttons, honestly, aren't even that bad. The triggers. The triggers are so horrible. They are the worst triggers that we've ever had in a modern game controller, by far. It's not even close. There's no competition there. So bad that pretty much all the first-person shooter games that came out on the PS3, they had you had to aim and shoot with the shoulder buttons instead of the triggers, because that's how bad and uncomfortable the triggers were. I have no idea what they were smoking when they designed this controller. It still baffles me to this day. If you had a 360 controller in your hands, it felt so much better. Like, so much better. Way better than using this. Like, I don't know anyone that wants to still use a DualShock 3 in 2026. I know people who still use a 360 controller, though. And that's a little foreshadowing for the higher rankings on this list. But, oh my god. I still don't understand what they were thinking. Terrible controller. I mean, it's not quite to the level of these, but, it was serviceable enough, I suppose. But still pretty bad. And then we have the Panasonic 3DO. You also had Sanyo and Gold Star 3DOs. I mean, it's all going to be lumped in there. The controller was not the main problem for the 3DO. The 3DO was just a terrible platform, terrible system, awful concept, etc., etc. Very expensive, and you got nothing for it. But my god, you have, it's 1994. And, I'm going to use the same criticisms that I did with the Jaguar. You only have 3 buttons. Like, what are we doing here? And then the D-pad is also atrocious. Like, we don't need to really get into that. I mean, do we really need to talk too much about the 3DO controller? I think we could just move on to the Vectrex. Oh my god, this chunky boy right here. I mean, the whole Vectrex was chunky. It was a TV screen. It was a console inside a TV screen. You had to buy the screen as part of the console. So it was a very unique concept. And the controller was kind of similar to an arcade stick, where you had the 4 buttons over here, and you had kind of like an arcade stick. But it was very uncomfortable, like, as a console, as a controller. It just didn't work. And, the Vectrex itself didn't work, and was one of the biggest failures in the 1980s. Alright, so moving on to the C tier. Let's see if this also makes people angry. Yeah, starting off with the Joy-Con. The Joy-Con is fine, but it also depends on what is the criteria, because there's so many different ways to use the Joy-Con. First of all, there's the using it on the actual Switch itself as a handheld. In that case, I think it's fine. But if we're judging it as, using the controller stand and using the Joy-Cons as part of a actual console controller experience, it falls flat in many different ways. First of all, not having a D-pad, which I know I've said, if we're basing it on modern standards, it's not a big deal, but considering the fact that the Switch relies heavily, one of its selling points being, playing Switch games online, playing NES games and Super Nintendo games on the Switch online, like having retro games available to you, This D-pad ain't gonna cut it, son. It's pretty much just the same buttons as the ABXY, and the reason why they did that is so one player can detach one, and the other can detach the other, and certain games like Switch Sports, you can use a single Joy-Con, and, that way, I guess it works, but, yeah, if we're judging it as a controller, it's gotta be it's gotta be in the middle tier. It's not horrible, but it's also, like, you're probably gonna want to buy the Switch Pro controller, because it is better in comparison. And also the stick drift. The stick drift is pretty bad. But again, overall, I can't really put it lower than C just because the Joy-Con was a huge part of the Switch's success in the first place. So it'd feel weird putting it in, like, D tier or below. I mean, it's definitely not F tier. But yeah, I can't see... I don't think the Switch should be any higher than what it is here. And as someone who grew up with the PS2, I love the PS2. But the DualShock 2 shouldn't be any lower than C tier. I mean, shouldn't be any higher than C tier. I mean, it's got a pretty bad D-pad, which, again, I can excuse, I guess. But also, I mean, the analog sticks, yeah, I mean, they're not the best. They're not terrible either. But it really comes down to, similar to the PS3, the triggers not being very good. With the rise of first-person shooters and shooting games, where the triggers are actually more important than they were the previous generation. That being said, I think the triggers are actually better on the DualShock 2 than the DualShock 3. The DualShock 3 are just so uncomfortable and so bad. But this just, it feels like an average controller. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. It's not great, but it's not terrible either, so I feel like C tier is fitting. Same thing with the Steam controller. I know a lot of people hyped out about the new Steam controller, not the old one that we talked about, the new one. It's fine, but it's also $100, which is more expensive than most other controllers. I know you can argue that it's more competing with, like, the Xbox Elite than a standard game controller, but I don't know about that. I feel like it's trying to appeal more towards a regular, like a standard controller, like the Xbox Series and DualSense. I mean, the D-pad, from what I've heard and what I've seen, is actually pretty decent. Even though it's like, a lot of it is kind of like, it's similar to the Steam Deck gamepad, the D-pad, but it's serviceable. Like, it's not horrible. And the thumbsticks are fine, the buttons are fine, but really what it comes down to is the trackpad's taking up half the space of the controller. If you're actually trying to use the standard controller experience, it feels like a little bit too crampy and is not all that good. Like, if you're mainly using it for the trackpads, then it's fine. You have enough space and it's comfortable, but it's just awkward. It's an awkward control layout. It has its niche, I guess, so if it's something that you feel like you can get a lot of use out of to have that mouse-like precision while also using standard control buttons, then it might be okay. But if we're just judging it, like, overall, I think I would say it's mid-tier, especially at its price. At its price, it shouldn't be any higher than this. Same thing with the Wii U gamepad. I say it's also worthy of a C tier. It's not bad, and it does have certain use cases, like the new Steam controller, but it's just way too much, and like having the screen in there, honestly, was more of a detriment to the Wii U's success than a benefit. It had certain benefits, like if you want to play split-screen games with your friends, you can have one friend actually use the screen on the gamepad, and then have the other one using the actual TV. So you could play local multiplayer with your friends without the screen actually being split, which is pretty cool. But at the same time, I don't think we needed this whole thing. There's some games that utilized it, but they were few and far between. Like, not too long after the Wii U came out, you already had most games not even bothering to utilize the touchpad at all. So it's basically like a home console DS. That was the entire concept of the Wii U. The actual controls themselves actually weren't bad. It did feel, it was a little chunky, and it had like that rectangle shape, so it wasn't very ergonomic, but the actual quality of the control itself was decent, and it was fine for what it was, actually. I would say it's actually, like, if you're judging it just as a controller, it's fine, and it's actually pretty good. But, Yeah, we didn't need the whole touchpad, gamepad, whatever the hell you want to call it. It didn't resonate. Then we have the Neo Geo controller, which was honestly very interesting. So it's kind of something in between an analog stick and a D-pad. It's supposed to basically have more precision than a standard D-pad. You see how you had 8 directions instead of the typical 4 directions that you had at the time with the D-pad. But it had very limited use case. For certain fighting games, like having that extra precision was beneficial and was a game changer, made a huge difference. But for most genres, like platformers and other stuff, didn't really utilize or take advantage of the increased directions and the 8-direction layout. The buttons, though, were pretty good, and having those shoulder buttons were also pretty good. So it was overall a decent controller, but this stick was very flawed. Like, if you ever actually played a Neo Geo game, you know what I'm talking about. And then I'm also going to lump these two together. You have the Amazon Luna controller and the Google Stadia controller. These were the streaming platforms that... I mean, Stadia's shut down. Luna's not shut down yet, but it's getting there. They just announced, like, a whole bunch of games that are no longer going to be on there. So you pretty much can't play anything on there anymore. Like, it still technically exists, but barely. As controllers, like, they're fine. Like, if you ever used any of those controllers, they're okay for what they are. This is kind of... The Stadia controller is kind of interesting because it kind of combines the DualShock 4 with the Xbox controller. And actually, from what it does have a really good D-pad, and is overall, like, pretty comfortable to use. I'd say one downside with that, though, is that if you try to buy one now, it's bricked. Because you had until the end of 2025 to convert it from a streaming device, like from a Wi-Fi, because this connected separately to your Wi-Fi, compared to it being Bluetooth, like a standard controller, because this was part of a streaming experience. The idea of the controller having its own connection to the internet, providing the least amount of latency possible for a streaming box, but considering the streaming platform itself failed, like, it's a decent controller, and people who were able to convert it to Bluetooth before it shut down are still using it and still enjoying it, but yeah. I don't think we could put this in the B tier, or, it's not bad enough where you could put it in the D tier. And same thing with Luna. They're just kind of, they're there, basically. They exist. They're one of the controllers of all time. That's the best you could say about them. Then we have the Amiga CD32, which honestly I think is overall a pretty decent controller. I actually like the handles on top instead of on the bottom. The D-pad, though, was, not terrible, but also not great. The 4 buttons were actually pretty good. But, at the end of the day, it's still, I'd say it's an average controller. The Amiga CD32 was one of the biggest failures in gaming history. The controller was not the problem, but it's just like, I don't know. For a console like that barely made a splash, and barely has any games to really play, like, it's a decent controller, but I can't really justify putting it in the B tier or higher, is what I'm saying. But speaking of B tier, we have some good entries over here. Alright, so starting off with the DualShock 4. The DualShock 4 is a drastic improvement over all the other DualShocks that we've had. The analog sticks feel a lot more comfortable. The controller itself is just so much more ergonomic. The triggers, oh my god, the triggers are finally decent. I didn't say great, I said decent, but in comparison to what we've had with the previous PlayStation controllers, oh my god, was the DualShock 4 a breath of fresh air. It was actually usable. Very usable. The touchpad, I don't know. I don't have anything good or bad to say about it. I think it's fine, I guess. But it has, very limited use cases. I mean, the most I've ever used the touchpad for was just using it as another button. Changing from third person to first person in Grand Theft Auto 5, for example. The select and start and the sides are okay, I guess. Because the touchpad takes up so much room. It takes up a lot of room, but it's not like the Duke controller where it's just obnoxious how it takes up space, if that makes sense. So overall, it's good. It's not great, but it's good. That's really like where it all comes down to. I know some people consider the DualShock 4, like a lot of people disagree and would put it in the A tier, but I just don't think it's as good as the A tier controllers, and we'll get more into that conversation as we get to the A tier. But let's move on to the Switch One Pro controller, which I'd say is a must for anyone who wants to seriously play games on the Switch as a console, as a console experience, because you actually have a real D-pad, and the thumbstick layout is, the thumbsticks are a lot better than the little tiny ones on the Joy-Cons. The ABXY buttons also feel a lot better. The bumpers and the triggers are so much better than what we get from the regular Joy-Con. I'd still say like it's overall good. I wouldn't say it's great and stands out and is like really, 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 really good. But it's good. Same thing, the Wiimote Nunchuck is also like it's iconic, right? And it was a great experience in a lot of ways. Also held a lot of games back. Certain games that had forced motion controls. It was obnoxious in the way that some of the motion controls were forced. In a lot of ways, it felt more like a hindrance than something that was beneficial and was a serious like game changer, like in terms of how you play games. Like it worked great with some, not so great with others. The fact that it was shoehorned and forced into most of the games on the Wii, I would knock it down a little bit just because of that. But just overall, yeah, it was a good controller and a good experience. I think I would say that for sure. The Switch 2 Joy-Con, I would say, is an improvement over the original. Not by much, but enough of an improvement where I would say, yeah, it could. I would say it's B tier. It seems like the drift issue is while I've heard it's still there, not nearly as bad as the original. So it's been improved a little bit. And the thumbsticks feel a little better. The bumpers and triggers do feel quite a bit better. And overall, yeah, I mean it's not a huge change over the original, but enough where I would say, yeah, I'd bump it up a little bit. And it is a little bit better if you're using it like as a controller than the Switch 1. Wii U Pro controller, actually, I really enjoy. I think it's a really good controller. There's only one real reason why it's not in the A tier instead of the B tier, and that's because there were certain games that required motion control, which the gamepad did offer. The gamepad on the Wii U had motion control. There were certain games like Splatoon where you couldn't properly use the game, like you couldn't properly play it, to the point where Nintendo recommended you attach a Wiimote and tape it to the back of the Wii U Pro controller in order to get that motion control experience. Not having the built-in motion control created some compatibility problems. Most games played fine, but considering there are some games, like if you think of games like ZombiU, for example, where you absolutely had to play the game with a touchpad. If you didn't have the touchpad, then the game wouldn't work. Like, you had to use the gamepad to play the game. And, certain games requiring the motion controls. That's why it's bumped down. Otherwise, it would be A, because I think this button layout is honestly close to perfection. I love it, like, if you're trying to play like a retro game, you just, you kind of move your hands a little bit lower, and you can just use the D-pad and the ABXY. They're right next to each other. You don't have analog sticks blocking the way. It doesn't feel weird or awkward to use the D-pad like most modern controllers do. If you want to, like, just use the gamepad, even if the D-pad is decent, like, it's kind of awkward to use the D-pad for most modern controllers. But this one, it's actually great. And since, the Wii U still had a virtual console and a lot of retro games to play, it was great to have that kind of layout. You had the best of both worlds. You can play modern and retro games on the same controller. The analog sticks were also really good. I know some people didn't like them both being on the top compared to them both being on the bottom for the PlayStation, or, having one like this and one like that for the Xbox. But I think overall, it was a pretty good controller with, bumpers and triggers were also good. It had an insane battery life. Like, this thing could last up to 80 hours, which is crazy. But yeah, I would say the Wii U Pro Controller, bring it back. Nintendo, bring it back. I would honestly buy one, and unironically, I would use it. Like, if there was a Wii U, if I could use a Wii U Pro Controller on my PC, and it had, like, I could play the same games that I could play with a regular Xbox, like if it had X input, sign me up. I would love to do that. Love to play games like that with that controller. It's awesome. Pretty underrated, I would say. GameCube controller is also pretty good. I like the shoulder buttons on top, or triggers, whatever you want to call them. Then you had like the one shoulder button, so you didn't have two shoulder buttons, so it was a little weird compared to. Well, honestly, it was probably better than what the Xbox offered, but you know we'll talk about the Xbox soon with the original redesign. I think it was overall a pretty good controller that, for its time, you know, most games played pretty well with it. I think fighting games and you know, platforming games and a lot of them, even Metroid Prime as a first-person shooter, played pretty well with this control layout. I liked having the D-pad like right next to the right stick, and then having this stick over here. I love the ABXY, the A button being the button you use the most, having it front and center, and it being huge, and you know, being like the main what the entire layout is centered around, instead of it just being the same size as all the other buttons, and then the B and the X and the Y. I think it's a great controller, honestly. I think it's fantastic. And honestly, I enjoyed using the GameCube controller on the Wii more than I did like using the actual Wiimote and nunchuck. But I would say it's not great because, I mean, it wasn't the most comfortable controller. Like, it was still good, but I would say, you know, it really just comes down to the controllers I have on the A tier being so much better in comparison. Okay, so Xbox controller, the OG, is just it's if you take away these bumpers and these buttons, like the start and select being on the left side, and the two bumpers being on the right side, this would be a great controller. And I would put in the A tier, and even think about S tier, because it is really, really good. And it obviously served the foundation and basis for what would become the modern Xbox controller, which is great. I mean, they are the best controllers that we have. But this is just really awkward. Like, a lot of times you're hitting the A button, and you're trying not to accidentally hit the bumpers, and it's just not comfortable because you want to rest your thumb kind of like in between the right stick and the B button and the A button when you're playing a game, and you can't really do that because of those two bumpers being in the way and not being very comfortable. I would have been fine with them. You know, obviously it's better to have the two bumpers as bumper buttons, like as we now know them, like as shoulder buttons. But it honestly would have been better to have like a more modern, you know, to have like this same layout, like, you know, better than the Duke, but to have the same 6-button layout as the Duke, if that makes any sense. So have these buttons, like the ABXY, like maybe a little bit lower, and then put the black button here and the white button here. And I think that would have been kind of interesting. And honestly, I wonder what it would be like to have like a 6-button layout on a controller with shoulder buttons, with triggers, and with 2 analog sticks. I wonder if there's any games that would really be able to utilize the 6-button layout, like modern games. But yeah, I'd say, you know, it's a good controller, but you never want to go back to it. And it was, you know, very annoying having to deal with that shit, having to deal with the bumpers in between the right stick and the AVXY. And then we have the Genesis, the original Genesis controller, the 3-button controller, which, as you know, eventually we got a 6-button controller, which was able to utilize, you know, there are fighting games and a lot of games that really needed more than 3 buttons. And the Super Nintendo had 4 buttons, so this controller felt very lacking in comparison when it came to certain titles. And the D-pad was also, you know, not great, like not terrible, but also not great. So that also knocks it down to B tier. But overall, it felt very comfortable Like, the shape of it and the overall experience was really good and was part of what made the Genesis special. So I can't really knock it down too much. And the buttons just felt very satisfying to click, too. But yeah, if it just had, like, a little bit more... Like, if it had a few more buttons... Like, if it came with the 6-button layout, it'd be an A tier. And if the D-pad was a little bit better, it'd be an S tier, honestly. Magnavox Odyssey. So, yeah. Again, like, a lot of this is time relative. If we're just judging it, like, as a whole, yeah, like, you know, like, those knob controls were pretty bad and uncomfortable and not the most responsive and not the best. It was just a giant box with 2 knobs on the side. But it worked for what it was at the time. Again, the Odyssey was the first console that we ever had, basically. So, I'm not going to knock it down too much. It kind of worked for what it was at the time, being very limited to Pong. That's the only game that was able to run on that thing. And all the Pong controllers, too, were very similar. Like, the Atari made their own Pong console. There were a whole bunch of Pong... Nintendo had a Pong console, and they all pretty much had a similar layout to this. So, yeah, B tier, I think, is fitting. And then we have the Commodore 64 GS. So this was the console version of the Commodore 64. They repackaged the Commodore home computer into a proper game console. And honestly, I like the joystick with the trigger on the back and the button on top, and then you have that button over here. Honestly, I think it was really cool. And, for a lot of the games that ran, these were basically computer games that were running on this console. It kind of worked, having that setup instead of just a standard D-pad with 2 buttons like the NES. But, yeah, I mean, I'd say overall it's pretty good. Not great, but it was unique, and it kind of worked for what it was. The actual, Commodore 64 console itself didn't work, but the controller was not the problem. All right, A tier. So this is where things get really, really, really interesting. DualSense is in the A tier. Not in the S tier. I mean, look, guys. I think the DualSense is a really good controller, and it's definitely the best that Sony's ever done. It definitely has a more premium feel, and it is more comfortable to hold than even the DualShock 4. The triggers are so much better too, with the haptic feedback and everything. So it did a lot of great things. And it's a really, 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 really good controller. I just don't think it's S tier. And you can probably already figure out what the S tier controllers are, considering what's not on the A tier and is obviously not on the other tiers too. So it pretty much just comes down to me thinking the S tier controllers are overall above the DualSense. There's not too many things wrong with it or bad with it, aside from less compatibility on PC compared to the Xbox controller. But I still think it's great. Switch 2 Pro controller. I was actually able to have one of those in my hands, and it does feel like an improvement. It's more comfortable to hold, and just feels overall higher quality in comparison to the Switch 1, especially when we're talking about the bumpers and triggers, especially the triggers. It is a really, really, really good controller. It even has mappable buttons, too. So it does kind of have that premium feel. But it is, like, really, it's like $85, $90, which is, a little bit much. Xbox One. Yeah, I mean, it's a great controller. It basically took the basis of the Xbox 360 controller and made it even better. The D-pad is probably the only bad thing you could say about it. Otherwise, it's close to perfect, close to perfection. Aside from, well, we'll talk about it more when we get into the S tier. You guys already can figure out what the S tier is going to be, but then we have the Genesis 6-button layout. So the D-pad is pretty much the same, but it adds 3 buttons. Having those 3 extra buttons is great when it comes to fighting games and other titles, So it's definitely an improvement overall over the original Genesis. Yeah, definitely. The Atari 2600. Now, a lot of people looking back at the 2600 joystick. I mean, the vast majority of people who are gamers today weren't around during that era, and I obviously wasn't around either. I'm not, in my late 50s, early 60s, because that's how old you'd have to be at that point to be growing up with Atari. However, I think you have to admit that, it was very simple and basic, but for what it was, it got the job done, and it was great, and it was part of the success of the 2600. You could attribute it to the joystick and the one button. I think the joystick was honestly great because arcade gaming was the main way to play games, was in an arcade. And having that joystick kind of made it feel like you had an arcade at home. And it felt, it felt pretty good using the joystick and the button. I think it was really good. Really good controller for its time. And if you have to think about like the most iconic video game controllers, like obviously NES would be in that conversation. But the 2600 would have to be part of that too. Like for the controllers that had the most cultural impact, it would have to be on there. And was a huge part of what made Atari, very successful at the time. And Sega Saturn, it's very similar to the 6-button Genesis controller, but it does have a better feel to it. Like it's the pinnacle. It's honestly the pinnacle of game controllers if you're talking about 2D gaming. If you're talking about 2D gaming and fighting games too, this is basically like the best that you'll ever get. Obviously, if you get into, some 3D games, it's very lacking. And that would make me I thought about knocking it down, but if you're talking about relative to the Saturn's library, which the Saturn actually had a great library of games, but mostly if you're in Japan. But it really was a fantastic controller that if the Saturn was successful in the States and actually was, ended up better than it was, they could have just done a DualShock approach and just added 2 analog sticks at the bottom. But, I understand why some people may be puzzled at the fact that I have this up here, but this down here for not having analog sticks. But considering the fact that, like I said, when I talked about putting the PS1 controller down there, the D-pad was horrendous. Like, that was a huge thing that took it away, because you needed the D-pad to play games. And the D-pad, you had, like, if you moved one, the other ones moved with it, and it was so uncomfortable to use, so bad. While in comparison, the D-pad was great, fantastic, and was better than what we got in the Genesis. But also the fact that, yeah, like the game library itself, like you had a lot of games on the PS1 where you needed the analog sticks. Not necessarily the case for the Saturn, although that speaks more to the Saturn's failure than anything else. But I would say, yeah. I mean, this is the perfect 2D gaming controller, and does deserve to be in the conversation, at least, of greatest video game controllers of all time. And I think they did a great job with it. I think they honestly did a better job with the Saturn controller than the Dreamcast, if we're going to be honest. Like, how do you take 2 buttons away, right? Which, it's fine having 4-button layout. That's the modern standard. But then, not having another stick, not having anything to make up for it, just taking buttons away and having less functionality for the control. You know what I mean? So, I don't know. Very weird what they going back to the Dreamcast controller, why they did, like, what was Sega thinking. And then, these are both NES controllers, by the way. We have the original from 1983 to the redesigned one that actually came out after the NES was already past its life cycle and the Super Nintendo was out and released. So I'm lumping these two together because the NES controller was a great controller, and it was the D-pad, it was the original D-pad. And the 2-button layout, it was perfect for the games that were out at the time. I was thinking about knocking it down to B tier just because of the rectangle shape and how uncomfortable it was, and how people would often get cramps using the controller. And that's where this controller actually improved things a lot. It's called the Dogbone controller. You can see it's shaped similarly to the SNES controller. But because of the fact that it came out after the 8-bit era was already past its prime, I can't really put it higher than A. And I can't really put the regular NES controller higher than A because of the fact that, yeah, it wasn't the most comfortable ergonomic. But it was revolutionary, so you can't really... No tier list with any credibility can put NES lower than A, in my opinion. But finally, let's get on to the S tier. We have 3 controllers in this tier. And that would be the Xbox 360, Xbox Series X, and Super Nintendo. So, let's get started with Xbox 360. Xbox 360 is like the gold standard when it comes to what you want in a modern game controller, to the point where all the really good modern controllers, like this one and this one, like they all come from the Xbox 360. It's like, you know, it hasn't aged very well. Like, I wouldn't use an Xbox 360 controller anymore, but especially compared to the competition at the time, if you like I said, if you had a DualShock 3 in your hands, then you picked up a 360 controller, it was a huge upgrade. The bumpers and the triggers were significantly better. The D-pad sucked, but you know, you can kind of forgive that, considering that we were moving towards the era of 3D gaming. Obviously, 3D era was in full swing, and most games didn't really utilize the D-pad aside from pressing, you know, one direction on the D-pad to, you know, go to your inventory or like whatever it was. Like, you didn't actually use it to control your character anymore. That just wasn't a thing. So you can kind of excuse that. But also, you know, the start and select, the thumbsticks, one on the left, one on the top left, one on the bottom right, that was honestly perfect. I mean, obviously that was kind of created by the Duke and the original Xbox, but this perfected that. And yeah, I mean, it's honestly as close as you can get to a perfect controller, especially if you're going by 2005 to 2013 standards, when this console was during its life cycle. And the Series X, I'm going to have to put in the S tier also. Maybe a hot take, I don't know. And there's a reason why I have it above the Xbox One. As much as I love the Xbox One controller, and as soon as I had an Xbox One controller, I would never use a 360 controller again. Like, it's probably been close to, I don't know, a decade or more since I used the 360 controller on my PC. Xbox One, though, as soon as the Series X controller came out, I never wanted to use the Xbox One controller again. And what I really love about it is just how simple it is, because you have companies like Sony that are like, we have to reinvent the wheel. Every time we make a new controller, it has to be wildly different from the last. And people were mocking Microsoft when they unveiled the Series X controller, saying it's, oh my god, they just copy and pasted the Xbox One controller just with a different D-pad, and that's basically it. Like, the layout is exactly the same. The only big difference is that it adds the share button, which allows you to take screenshots and all that other stuff, which, you know, it's just whatever. It doesn't really make a huge difference there. But the bumpers and the triggers are honestly so much better and so much more satisfying to use compared to the Xbox One controller. And the D-pad also is a lot better, for what it's worth. But, yeah, I mean, Series X, I will never choose another controller over Series X controller, like, in any circumstance. The DualSense controller's fine. It's really good. But I just view the Series X as a much better experience overall. Much more comfortable, just better. And then finally, the Super Nintendo. I mean, what can you say? It is close to perfection. It is a great controller for its time. for the 16-bit era, you had everything you needed. You had 4-button layout instead of the 3-button layout that the Genesis had, a great fantastic D-pad, and the shoulder buttons as well. And it felt very comfortable to hold in your hands. Can't think of a single flaw that controller had. Same thing with all of these, really. I mean, the one thing I'd say about the 360 would be the battery pack in the back felt a little bulky, you know? But otherwise, I mean, you could just get a wireless one without, that didn't have a battery pack if you wanted. And then also, yeah, plug in the microphone into the Xbox was huge. Like, that was a big feature back then. I forgot to mention that. Because the PS3 didn't really have that. And it kind of became the modern standard of, like, plugging a headset into the controller, which the Xbox One and Series X would also add in and have. So, that's pretty much my, ranking of all of the controllers. Let me know what you guys think, if you agree or disagree with any of these rankings. As always, thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys again soon. Bye.